In Texas, we had some things that we voted on as well, which were 17 constitutional amendments. And you may be thinking, well, that's far less interesting than the other elections, right? Where you're talking about people. Well, can I tell you? Here's what happens, right? Texas is an interesting state. Texas is a state that says we should have limited government. Our legislature, right, only meets for 140 days every other year. Okay, so that's government in Texas. We've got the ABCs, the agencies and the boards and the commissions that take our legislative rules that are passed in each legislative session and they put them into effect, right? And so we don't have a state legislature that's meeting every day, dealing with the affairs of people, right? They meet for 140 days every other year, and then they give that responsibility to those agencies, boards, and commissions. They say, listen, here's your resources, here's your money, here's your vision. Go put that, right? You're the people, you're the bureaucratic system, right? Go put these rules into effect. But one of the other things is, right, our Constitution is not something that gives a lot of direction. And so it needs to be constantly amended and updated. So it's very different. So I'm holding, here's a picture, right, of the U.S. Constitution, right? If you don't have a copy of one of these, by the way, you need to get one, right? What an incredible document. The U.S. Constitution, Declaration of Independence. Texas Constitution is very different than the U.S. Constitution. And so it is constantly up for amendment because when the legislature needs to do things, right, they have to constantly amend our Constitution, right? U.S. Constitution, very, very difficult to amend, isn't supposed to be amended unless it's super important. The legislature, right, is the thing that's doing most of the rules that are affecting our lives. And so the Constitution is something that's over here being protected, right, from the U.S. standpoint. Texas is a little bit different, right? Texas, a lot of these things have to go through constitutional amendments. And so the legislature will meet, they'll come together and they'll find the areas, right, where they need to say, hey, our Texas Constitution needs to be amended. And this time we had an opportunity to vote on 17 of these things that they brought forward. I think the last check that I had was there have been 547 changes, okay, 547 changes to the Texas Constitution since it was adopted in 1876, right? So very, very different than the U.S. Constitution, which has 26 amendments. The Texas Constitution has 547. And so what were those amendments? What did each one of them do and look at? Well, kind of a fascinating thing, right? Some of them dealt with giving greater money back to people, right? So we talk about homestead exemptions and things like that. There's several different things in here that are looking at saying, we want Texans to have more of their money, less of it going to the school districts, less of it going to the government. And so our homestead exemptions have increased, and different people, right? So if you are a spouse of somebody who served in the military, right, you get those same particular benefits. So that's one of the things that Texas is looking at, right? How can we give more money back to people so that they're responsible for the money instead of giving it to the government? Right. And that's, how in Texas, we don't have a state income tax. And so everything's done through property taxes and sales taxes. Right. So those are very, very important. Right. What value is your property at and how much can the government tax you? Well, if you can get more of your property to be valued for your own and the government can't tax you on that. Right. That's just more money back into the pockets of Texans to do with what they want, right? And that's one of the things that you saw in the constitutional amendments for Texas is, right, our legislature is saying, hey, give more money back to Texans, right? That's what they want. Water is a super important thing here, right? So we had one of those on there. Prohibiting a tax on capital gains, right? Again, Texas wants, if you make money, right, Texas wants you to keep more of your money, right? Less of it being taxed. Let's see, other things in here. The new stock exchange, right, that's looking at coming to Texas, right? They enacted, right, Proposition 6 dealt with enacting a law imposing an occupation tax on certain entities that enter into transactions conveying securities, right? So again, getting ready for Texas and those businesses coming from New York And that stock exchange isn't only in New York, but there's going to be one here in Texas, right? Of more responsibility of Texas, because we give more of the freedoms to people and less to government. More businesses are moving here, more people are moving here. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about is the redistricting that's happening in Texas and how the rest of the country is dealing with that, right? Texas doesn't have an inheritance tax. More control of your money. I'm telling you, out of these 17, right, a majority of these deal with the idea that we want more people to have more control of their money. One of the things I thought was great, though, Proposition 12 dealt with judges, right? There's going to be individuals, a majority of citizens who are going to be on a committee that deals with judicial misconduct. Where before it was all judges looking at judicial misconduct. In Texas, we're saying, no, we don't want just judges watching other judges, right? It's kind of like, the fox watching the hen house, right? We want citizens, average people to be on there and provide accountability to our judges, which, by the way, in Texas, we get to elect our judges, right? So we get to, not our judges aren't appointed, right? We've got, the Court of Criminal Appeals, we've got the Texas Supreme Court, we've got all these different courts that we have in Texas, and we get to elect those particular positions. So important. But when there's a judge that is brought up on judicial misconduct, right, is it just other judges that are looking at that conduct? And the state of Texas said, no, we want citizens on that particular review committee as well. So important from that standpoint. But then the two that really people thought were the most important was Proposition 15 that said parents are the primary decision makers for their children. Literally, that's the language of the constitutional amendment, right? Parents are the primary decision makers for their children, right? And Texans went to the ballot box and said, yes, we affirm that, right? We're in other states, right, that is not being affirmed. And then a voter must be a U.S. citizen, right? And so Texas is cleaning up its voter rolls. I think the last thing that I saw was, some of our voter rolls had literally thousands of people who were not U.S. citizens, right? And those people are being cleared off the voter rolls. So they don't have a right and a responsibility to go and vote because they're not U.S. citizens, right? Why should they tell the rest of the citizens of Texas or the citizens of this particular country how to do business and what the law should be if they're not even citizens of this particular country? Right. And then the last one was dealing with border security. Right. And so just how does that work?